everyone, welcome to Two Car Pros. My name is Ryan, and today is really exciting because we're going to be continuing our how to build a 5.3 liter 3-valve Ford modular engine. So last time we did a video on this, we took the crankshaft out and sent that off to the machine shop. It's all part of a playlist right here on YouTube that shows you exactly how to rebuild one of these engines. The machine shop took about 3 or 4 weeks, which is typical for a machine shop. Don't rush them. It's not that big a deal to wait and get a quality product. I will go over total cost of machining and all the parts at the very end of this series, so you're gonna have to wait for that one. I want that to be an all-inclusive number. So now that the block is back from the machine shop, we can inspect it, wash it, put the crankshaft in it, and set the thrust play. We're also going to plastic gauge it because I know how much you all love that. Normally in this part of the video, I call it the 3 C's of engine assembly: clean, crankshaft, camshaft, but the cams are in the head, so this is just cleaning and the crankshaft today, but it's still really important to get all those fine details correct. Before we go any further, let's go ahead and thank our sponsor, Summit Racing. Summit Racing has been an incredible sponsor. I've used them for decades. My family's been using them since the 70s. They are our go-to performance parts distributor. They have fast shipping, easy returns, and dynamite customer service. So make sure you buy all your speed parts at summitracing.com. So in this stage of engine assembly, you really want to go slow and be meticulous. Take your time. You don't want to mess this part up. It's pretty much the most important part is main cap bearings and setting our thrust. Those are pretty much the most important, as well as putting on the rod bearings, but we will get to that in another episode. Now, the stock bolts that came with your 5.4 are torqued to yield, which means that they are torqued down and then they're yielded, so they stretch, and effectively the bolt is ruined. You can use them to check the squish on plastic gauge. That's about as much as I'd use them for. I'd go ahead and throw them into the trash. They're no longer able to use effectively in an engine and get the correct amount of clamping forces. It's not worth it. Just buy the new bolts. You can either buy the regular torque to yield bolts and use them once and you're going to put this back together and everything's good to go, or you can go the route I went, which is getting ARP studs and fasteners that are reusable. You can just keep using them until the end of time. They're really beefy bolts. They're not torque to yield, but they do have a different torque spec. So that information comes with our ARP bolts, but if you use the stock ones, just use the stock torque settings and you're good to go. Usually it'll be like a torque figure and then turn it 90 degrees and then another 90 degrees, I believe, is the way those are torqued to yield on the standard bolts. But again, I have the unstandard bolts, so deviating a little bit into the performance area, and honestly, I kind of recommend it. I think it's the way to go, but I wanted to point that out in case there was any confusion down the road. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump in. We're going to inspect our block, clean it, and put our crankshaft in. So first thing back from the machine shop, you want to inspect the block. You want to make sure that the cross hatchings look good inside the cylinder bores, and they do. They look amazing. They even painted it for me. They surfaced this deck to make sure that it is nice and flat. Everything looks fantastic, but make sure you just kind of inspect everything before you leave the machine shop. Once you get it home and put on your engine stand exactly the same way you did before, we're going to give it a little rinse with some hose water. Some people use distilled, and I think that is an awesome way to go, but I don't have any, so I've always just used hose water, and it's been fine for me. You don't need to like blast it or anything. You just want to get it in every nook and cranny you can. And then I have down here in my bucket some laundry detergent and a microfiber towel, and we're just going to go into every single cylinder like this. Actually, what I should do is clean it in between cylinders. Start over. And just get into every hole you can find. Get it as clean as you can. And why am I doing this? It seems counterintuitive, right? Because this is an iron block and it can rust. And you're right, it can. So, what we're going to do is move quickly. And try to do this not in the sun. It is nice when it's kind of dark out. About the same time you'd wash your car normally, I've found has worked great. And you guys can see what I'm doing, which is cool. And then we're going to keep it wet so it can't just flash rust on us. And we are doing this because machining is a very kind of messy business. There's lots of little chips that get everywhere and you don't know where they've been. And just one of those chips can ruin your entire engine. So be as thorough as you possible on this. So do not be shy. Get it from every angle. You do not want any kind of metal chips. So make sure everything's very, very clean. So once you're pretty sure you've cleaned it very thoroughly, I've sat here for at least 20 or 30 minutes doing this. You can kind of see that my towel has got some ickies on it. I've been doing my best to, like, you know, wring it out and stuff. And then once we're at this stage, what we want to do is rinse it off really well. We don't want any kind of soap scum on here. And if you have distilled water, now's the time to rinse it off with distilled. So I actually found some distilled water. I'm just gonna go ahead and hose it down with distilled, and hopefully that'll kind of mitigate the mineral content in the hose water. I mean, it's not gonna be perfect, but it will stop those minerals in regular tap water. It won't stop the rusting though. We have to go a little bit beyond that stepwise. But this will help with calcification. What I'm gonna do is take some WD-40 and just hose it down. I mean, if I could dip it in WD-40, I would. So we're gonna hose it on down. Don't worry about drying it off first because we don't want it to flash rust, and it will. Think about washing your car on the brake rotors. Have you ever noticed that when you wash your car and then just go to dry it, but you can't obviously dry your brake rotors, they rust, they get a surface rust on them, and it's fine when you're on the brake rotors because the brake pads will just take it off, it's no big deal, and move on with your life. But surface rust on bearing surfaces on the mains, or heaven forbid in the side of the cylinders, is absolutely detrimental, and you do not want that for obvious reasons. Really spray it on. Spray it on nice and thick. Do the deck surface. Anything that's not painted, hose it down with some WD-40. And obviously I'm not going to go over every single surface. Just use your best judgment and you will be fine. The next thing we can do is, I really like this air sprayer with the rubber tip on it. We just dry our block off. Seriously, get into every little nook and cranny. Blow it all out. This will also ensure that any kind of metal chips in here are getting blown out and not inside your engine. All the oil galleys, everything. Even go into the oil feeds for the main cap. Blow those out, bottle brush them. Just go nuts on the cleanliness. And again, now that our block is, you know, more or less dry, a lot of the water has been pushed off, so it's not just pooling everywhere. Go ahead and hose it again with WD-40. Yes, again. You can't use too much, especially inside of these cylinders. So again, now that our block is more or less clean, it's very clean. I've really gone to town in every single bore I can find. You even use a bottle brush, it's a good idea. Just make sure everything's insanely clean and then finish it up by hosing it off with just a huge amount of WD-40. Do not be shy. It is basically impossible to use too much. And that will keep all our metal surfaces rust-free. So that way, when we put this block together, everything will be okay, because you're not going to be able to throw this thing together in one day. It's going to take you a little while, take you some time, and the WD-40 buys you that time. So our main caps are already out of our engine. They still have a lot of WD-40 on them, and we don't know about this surface right here. This surface is obviously dirty. It's been out of our sight, and we can't have any dirt in there before we put a bearing in. So what we're going to do is take some carburetor spray, oops, and hose it off. What we want to do is make sure you get this surface here really good, and this surface as well, and where the bearing is actually going to ride. See all the ickies on there? You can't have that on any of these surfaces, here that actually touch the engine or the bearing. So we can try wiping it again. And if there's any dirt, look how this is nice and clean. If there's any dirt on that wipe, just keep cleaning it. You can't be too clean when you are reassembling your engine. You also can't have any oil right here, which is really easy to do because the whole thing has been soaked with WD-40. So, you know, be meticulous. Maybe do it twice, 3 times. That'd be okay. And then just to make sure there's no fuzzies from the microfiber, what we're going to do is take some compressed air and just blow it out. Now this cap is ready for bearing installation. So for our bearings today, I've chosen these Clevite Moly triple metal bearings. They're made in the US. They're about $100 and they're worth the investment. Remember, we didn't have our crank ground under, so these are the stock size bearings. There's our part number. These were provided by Summit Racing and a link is located down below in the description. So what we can do is open our box, take the thrust bearings out because we don't need those just yet. That's what these look like. We'll go over that later. And take the bearing set out. So for each cap, you need one of each of these from each set, but you'll notice on the bearings with a hole, 4 of them are the same and 1 is different. So the bearings, be careful here, you don't want to mar the bearing surface on either side. One set of the bearings has a hole in it, and that goes in the block. And 4 of those are exactly the same, but you'll notice on this one, instead of the hole being in the top of the arch for the bearing, it's actually on the side, and this goes on number 1 in the block. So we're going to worry about that in just a little bit. Now you'll notice that these bearings don't have any holes in them at all. These are intended for your main caps, and all of these are the same. So these are just going to go in all of our caps, all exactly the same way. So we can grab one of these bearings and move on to putting it in our number 1 cap. So we're going to take our bearing that doesn't have a hole in it that I showed earlier, one of the plain bearings, and normally when you get bearings they're very clean from the factory, but if you're concerned about it, go ahead and clean them like we did before with some carburetor spray and compressed air. So you'll notice on the bearing there's a little tang right here, a little notch, sometimes it's called a lock, and then there's an adjoining lock just there on the cap. So what we can do is just set our bearing in and then push it down. And it should just fit really nice. You shouldn't like struggle to put it in. It should just kind of be a nice machine fit. And you want to make sure that this surface right here on the cap is dead even with that surface on the bearing. So this should be totally flat. You should not be able to feel like a ridge or anything. And then you know the bearing is fully seated. And then we're going to take some of our old friend Permatex Ultra Slick, link down below in the description. And what I like to do is just put a little dab on the end of my finger, and then we're just going to lube up this bearing surface. Actually, I think it needs a little bit more. Not a lot though, because we don't want the engine to start dry, and don't go all the way up the side of the bearing, because if it gets in between the bearing and the cap, it has a chance to spin a bearing, which is obviously not what we want. So that is what it should look like, so that the lube is not quite at the top of that bearing surface. So it should look just like that, and go ahead and do that for the rest of the caps. So now what we can do is that we're on number 1 for the block. This is actually our engine, is get some carburetor spray, and once again hose it down and clean it off. And clean where the cap actually goes, where it actually sits on the engine, and then where the bearing is going to reside as well. Oh yeah, it looks much cleaner. I like that a lot. And then of course we're going to blow the fuzzies away. Like that, and then we can install our bearing. And remember, on cylinder number 1 right here, it has that kind of funky off-center oil hole, and that's going to correspond with this groove in the block. And obviously you can't really put them in wrong anyway if you match the lock to the lock. So we can do it the exact same way we did our other bearing on the caps. Just push them in and make sure that this surface on the top of the bearing is parallel with the block. And you can kind of just massage it around with your fingers like that until it looks just like that. That looks fantastic. We once again grab our good friend Permatex Ultra Slick, put a little bloppy blop, and then come nearly to the top of the bearing, because again, we want to avoid that dry start, but we don't want this bearing to spin. And that is just absolutely fantastic. And then off camera, I'm going to spray some carburetor spray on my microfiber because I don't want to hose my bearing for number 1. And we can give number 2 here the same exact treatment. And the reason I'm going over number 2 is because number 2 is just like 3, 4, and 5, where it is a normal bearing. It doesn't have that offset hole, so I want to kind of clarify that and blow it away from number 1. Nice. And all the bearings that aren't number 1 going exactly just like this, with the hole pointing to the oil hole in the block. And we can just shimmy that down. If it gets sideways, it's okay. Just correct it with your fingers. And just make sure it is fully seated against the block itself. And again, these two surfaces are parallel with each other. Yeah, like that. That looks excellent. Put some Permatex Ultra Slick on there. And we're going to lube that bearing surface up. Nice. Now just do that exact same procedure for 3, 4, and 5. So here's the front of number 5, and why am I showing you that? Well, there is no like traditional thrust surface on these bearings. What they do is they kind of give you it in pieces. Here's 2/3 of them, and 2 of them are exactly the same. There's only one that's different. And what you do is you just take the bearing, the thrust surface bearing, and you just kind of set it in just like that for both sides. I can do the other one. Make sure the fluted side is facing out, because there's writing on this side. You can see that goes in, and you just kind of set them in there and leave them, and make sure that they're not going to fall out. And that's easier said than done. And you just want to make sure that it is against that surface perfectly, and you can see this little, arm piece of it is kind of keeping it in place, and you don't want that, in the way of the cap. So we have both of our thrust bearings set right there. So now that our bearings are in the engine block and lubricated and basically ready for our crankshaft, we have to get our crankshaft ready for the engine. And my crankshaft has been polished and cleaned very thoroughly by the machine shop. It hasn't been ground under. However, it has been out of my sight. So what I like to do is get some carburetor spray and just spray it in the oil holes. There's one right here. And you hose all the way through it. And then get some compressed air with a rubber tip so you can't scratch anything. Blow it through. No metal chips in there, no nothing. So do that for all the holes in here. And then for all these surfaces that the bearings are going to ride on, again, we're going to grab some carburetor spray and we're going to hose that down. And you can grab a nice microfiber, clean towel, and wipe that off. See, there's some ickies on there. We don't want that in our nice new engine. So just go to town cleaning that up with some carburetor spray and some compressed air until it just looks brand new. Very, very clean is what we're looking for. So I don't want to lubricate those thrust surfaces that we put in already, those bearings. So what I'm going to do is take a bit of Permatex Ultra Slick on the end of my finger, and I'm just going to lubricate the thrust surface on the actual crankshaft itself, which is right here. And then it's also on the top, right there. So just do that for the entire radius of both of those bearing surfaces. So then we can take our crankshaft, and I find it helpful to hold the snout with one hand and 2 fingers in the rear of it off the other, and then you just want to go as gently as you can straight down. Go slow until it plunks into place. You might need to, because the thrust surfaces are a little, there we go. Thrust surfaces are a little tricky to play with, but look, you can actually move it just a teensy bit so we know it's not binding, and that looks really good. Now at this point, do not spin the crankshaft. Leave it exactly how it is. If you spin it like this, you have a chance of either moving a bearing and it'll spin, or putting lube on a bearing we don't want and it'll spin and ruin your engine, so leave it the way it is. So now we can do, and between you and me, I think this bit is a little bit on the unnecessary side, but it is something to check if maybe you're really particular, is we're going to plastic gauge our bearing clearances. And the way you do that is you just take a length of plastic gauge, link down below in the description, and you just place it right there and put the cap on dry with no lube, torque it down, take the cap back off, and measure how much it is squished out. So then we can take our number 1 cap and place it gingerly. You don't want to disturb our plastic gauge, just come straight down with it. And the correct orientation, the bearing is dry, wiped the lube back off of it. Use the end of a hammer here, plastic. There we go. 2 of the old bolts. Now these bolts are torque to yield, which means you can only use them once, and the factory already used them. So it might be a good idea to invest in some reusable bolts, but they're okay for measuring squish. So just bring them down as evenly as you can. You don't want to like tighten one side down and then the other. And then we can go get our torque figure. So now we can grab our torque implement and torque it down to 32, but what I'm going to do is, see, my torque wrench hasn't gone off yet. I'm just going to kind of split the load as evenly as I can. $32, $32, and then what I'm going to do is pull them to 90 degrees. So on this, you can't break it up. You have to just pull it all the way to 90 in one shot. There we go. There we are. And then, the fun part, we take the cap back off. And you want to do that as evenly as you can as well. Just do everything evenly. Remove our cap. A lot of the time they'll just remain on the crank and so it's easier, but not this time. It actually came up on our cap, so we'll go look at that on our workbench. So over here on our workbench, we can see with our plastic gauge set that it's right at 2 thousandths, which is like perfect. That is absolutely right on the money. And what we can do is just clean that off and be able to install our caps. So here we have our new fasteners made by ARP and sent over by Summit Racing. There is a couple of key differences you really need to look out for. So on this kit, it says it's for a 4.6. It's for a 4.6 and 5.4. So this is probably more meant for like a Crown Vic or a Mustang, kind of in that neighborhood of automotive sphere, but it'll work for our engine as well. And there's 2 sets in there. You just need to pick the thicker one because the 5.4 is bigger engine. Also, for these side bolts, we have these made by ARP. You'll notice they're quite beefy. This is an M9. This is for a Ford modular side cap bolt. Now, earlier revisions of the 5.4 have an M8. This is a later one, so I got the M9, which is the bigger one. You're gonna have to figure out which one works for you. And these are amazing parts, and they're reusable. The original fasteners for the main caps, the side cap bolts and the main cap bolts are torque to yield. They're junk. Throw them in the trash. I would only use them to measure out plastic gauge, and that's about it. We can set aside our fastener lube, and it comes with washers, more washers, one for one set, one for the other. The smaller nuts and the bigger nuts, I'm pretty sure we're using the bigger ones. So you'll look inside this kit, and you will find big one, small one. Small ones for 4.6, big ones for 5.4. So we can go install these in our engine. So what we're gonna do is very carefully, you don't wanna bonk the sides of the crank. Truthfully, you could put these in before you put the crank, but I think it makes it a little more challenging. I like to do it after, is the side without the Allen on the top. So the blank side goes down to the block, just like this. And then I'm gonna grab a 4mm T-handle, and it just says hand tight in the instructions, so about that tight, and that's it. There's really no like torque setting for you. And then just do that for all of your stud holes. So on number 4, on this side, on the driver's side, if it was in the engine normally, we have this special one. And this special stud has to go here in order for the oil pickup tube to be mounted. This one has to go here. It's the only one that's picky, that minds where it is. So we're just gonna give it the same treatment and then give it some love. This one has a little smaller Allen. It's only 3mm. Just hand tight, that's enough. And there you go, all our studs are installed. So I have my bearing nice and lubricated. I cleaned off the plastic gauge for number 1. I have the correct orientation because the lock is over here and it matches up with the lock on the block. And it says number 1 on the top. You can't mix those up. So we're going to just gingerly now drop it down in there, grab my plastic hammer, and I'm just gonna give it some taps just like that, and that's how we're going to leave that. And go ahead and do that for bearings 1, 2, 3, and 4. Don't do 5 because it's a little special. So the reason I said stop on number 5 is because the number 5 has this thrust surface on the back. There is only one surface for the cap. I know it kind of seems like there should be 2, but there isn't. You take this bearing with this little notch at the top, and it goes into that little receiver in the cap, and then you just kind of put it on, and it might take you a try or 2, and that's okay. Just be calm, go slow, and I think that's where this tang is here for, so you can hold on to it while you're dropping it into position, just like that. Check that out, that looks really nice. I can give it some taps to get it started, And then I have this brass punch I found really helpful to kind of just, you know, get to go where I want. Just go as evenly as you can. And that is excellent. So the next step we're going to do is grab some of the ARP fastener lube that came with our kit and just squeeze a little bit out onto your finger. And we're going to do the threads of the stud. Make sure that's nice and lubricated. You don't have to go overboard with it. And then also you want to lubricate both sides of the washer. Both sides of the washer have to be lubricated. And why is that? That is because you need to get an accurate torque figure when we're going to town on these later on. And then you also want to lubricate the back of the nut. Nice. And then we can just put that down and start that. And go ahead and do that for each and every one of these stud nut combos. So now that all of the nuts have the fastening lube on them, I'm going to grab a 12mm 12-point socket, and I have my electric screw gun. Trust me, it's clutched out very, very low. And what we're going to do is I'm just going to bring them down to touch in a spiral pattern. You can either go clockwise or counterclockwise. I'm going to go clockwise for me, so we're going to go like this. So then we can move over. And it's like super light. We are not doing any meaningful tightening right now. I just don't want to sit here all day lowering down these nuts. Sweet. So before we tighten down our nuts, they're just down by, you know, the little screwdriver clutching out really easy. What we're going to do is put in our pins. And these pins have a flat spot where the hole is, so you kind of know where they're going to be, and you just want them to be parallel with the block, and we can just kind of tap them in. And what that does is it actually locates the main cap fore and aft, so you have to put these in. So we're going to take my M9 bolts, might be M8 for you, you just need to pay attention to that. I'm going to grab our good old friend silicone rubber, and I will leave a link down below in the description. And we're just going to put that underneath the head of the bolt and underneath the washer, because this goes into oil. And you want some oil resistance there, so that way it all seals up. We're going to take our rubber hammer, and I'm just going to put the bolt right here and tap. And once the bolt goes through, stop tapping and put the bolt in there. A little more. There we go. So now our pin is exactly where it needs to be because it doesn't actually bottom out on anything. You can actually push it down further and the bolt will never go in. So I'm just going to bring it down to touch. Now I haven't tightened that down basically at all. It's just resting against the block, and I can do the same thing for the other side. So what we're going to do is tighten down our main cap, so the big studs first. Don't worry about the side bolts just yet. We're going to grab our torque wrench, set it to 20 foot-pounds, and we're going to go from the inside out. And you can go whatever pattern you like, as long as it's a spiral. I like to go clockwise the way I'm looking at it. And what this is doing is bringing down our main caps and subsequently our crankshaft as even as possible. And that's going to make sure everything stays nice and concentric and happy, which is what we want on our engine. Because if your engine isn't happy, you ain't happy. And you want to work a little quickly. I mean, you don't have to set records or anything, but you want to work a little quickly because the RTV is setting. Our next step is 40 foot-pounds, and we're just going to repeat the process. A little bit of repetition today, but the key is to stay focused, stay on task, don't get distracted. That's a big one. In fact, close your door, your garage door, and lock it so that way nobody can come and distract you, because you cannot lose track of what you're doing here. This is absolutely crucial. And then make sure when you're tightening this to keep the socket perfectly perpendicular on the fastener, because if you have it slightly off and you apply force, it will fall off. And then our final torque figure for these top studs here, these top nuts I should say, is 60. So set your torque wrench to 60 and repeat the pattern. And those are all tightened down to 60. Now we can worry about the skirt bolts. So we can tighten our side bolts. I'm sorry you can't really see them, but they are a 11 millimeter 12 point. And that's what's on the side here. We're going to do the exact same pattern, kind of a spiral to 45 foot-pounds. Perfect. Second to last. And then our last one is this guy right here. And you know what that sound means? That sound means our crankshaft's installed. So with all of our fasteners nice and tight, you know what that means? It means we get to spin the crankshaft finally. Oh yeah. That is just so darn gratifying and satisfying. That is lovely. Look at that. Oh, it's absolute perfection. Now, if you can't grab the end of your crankshaft with one hand and do this back and forth with relative ease, that means the clearances are too tight and it needs to be remachined. Or if you can grab the crankshaft, any bit of it, and you can hear like a little metal then it's too loose. And again, it has to be remachined. And you might hear a little bit of the thrust bearing back here. That's all this is. Don't worry about that. That can move a teeny tiny bit. It's going to. There's nothing you can do about that. But I have to say, this crankshaft is installed beautifully. So I think this part of the thrust bearing check is a little unnecessary and you probably don't need to do it, but if I don't show you how to do it, I will get about 100 mean comments calling me all kinds of things. So I'll just show you how to do it. I have my dial indicator set up with the plunger on the end of the crank snout and it's perfectly perpendicular. I'm going to take my rubber hammer from earlier and I'm just going to go ahead and tap one of the weights of the crankshaft rearward. And we will see what our thrust end play is. So now that I've tapped it and it went back 1/1000th of an inch, looks like from my angle, which is perfect, I can go ahead and zero my gauge out. There we go, that looks pretty good. And then I'm gonna give it a nice little tap on the butt of the crankshaft. And it went forward about 1/1000th and a half, that neighborhood or so, which is exactly perfect, it's right on the money. So that is how to inspect your block, clean it, put your crankshaft in, check the thrust clearance, do the plastic gauge, all the things. It is a total blast and a lot of fun. It's super rewarding to put that crankshaft in and have it just spin like $1,000,000. And I really do recommend spending a couple extra dollars and getting the better bearings. You can get cheaper bearings, but like I said, they're pretty much the most important part of the engine is your main cap bearings and your rod bearings. So I just recommend spending a decent amount on them, getting the tri-metal ones so you have really beefy, enduring bearings. That's my personal take on it. Feel free to disagree with me down below in the comments. Thank you so very much for watching. If you found this video helpful or interesting at all, please consider giving a like or subscribing. It really helps the channel out. Thank you to Summit Racing for sponsoring this series, and I'll see you next time.